Hey, friends, we are continuing our journey in the Beatitudes. And so I want you to grab your Bible and we're going to turn to Matthew chapter 5 again. And we're going to look at the fourth verse. And the fourth verse reads this next Beatitude: Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. I don't know if you've experienced mourning that just gets to the very heart of who you are. I'm not sure if you've experienced the kind of loss that really just eats away at you. I've experienced that for the first time in my life when I was going through the death of a friend. She was my doctor, she was a close friend, and she died suddenly during surgery to remove a tumor that they had found. And it was very much a tragic surprise. One of the people that I'd had a chance to have dinner with my friend Nancy, was an author by the name of Abraham Verghese. Now, he was also a doctor, and he had written a book about his time at the East Tennessee State University Hospital, where he was first dealing with those who were HIV positive in the eastern part of Tennessee. And it was a very difficult time. And his story recounted how so many people struggled with not only their illness, but also the secrets surrounding their illness. I knew something about those secrets because I found out at 16 that I was HIV positive, but I didn't have the chance to really talk about it until I was much older and in very difficult circumstances. But in his book about HIV and about dealing with those first AIDS patients, he uses this quote: "Within your secrets lies your sickness." And I think for many of us, when we experience great loss, it's not just the loss of that person, but over 30 years of helping to walk people through great loss as a pastor, I've watched as people have not only dealt with the loss physically of that person, but also the loss of expectations, the loss of time to be able to put relationships back together, to do the things that they had always planned on doing. And so when Jesus says here in this beatitude, as one of his primary values, he says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." I'll be honest with you, I've really struggled with this particular beatitude when I was putting this lesson together. My friend Nancy that I was telling you about, that loss was so stark for me because it was so sudden. And she went out of our lives in such a quick and just tragic way. And I also had to deal with finding a new doctor, and I had to dealing with my own illness as an HIV positive person and dealing with all of the stigma that surrounds that. And it really was one of the most difficult times in my life. But the thing that I missed most about Nancy was that she was not only a doctor to those who were HIV positive, she was also an advocate. She cared so deeply about her patients that she was willing to walk into any situation and to be able to deal and confront with whatever the circumstances were. And I missed that. And to this day, I still miss it. And I've had some great doctors. It kind of reminds me of right after my grandmother died, I got a call from an older gentleman that I'd known when I was a little boy pretty well. He had been around our family for a while. His name was Tom. And I got a call after her funeral saying that he would love for me to come by. And as I got there and visited with him, he was in his 80s by this time. He was telling me about how much my grandmother loved me and how much she talked about me. And she had had a couple of copies of my books, and she had given Tom some of those copies of those books. And I just remember, feeling so proud that my grandmother would talk about me like that. But he said, I didn't invite you to come to my house just to tell you about how much your grandmother loved you. I wanted you to understand what an important role she played in my life. Tom, now, my whole life had been just the older gentleman who had been very quiet, but such a dignified man and who had been a good person to our family. But I had heard stories that back in his day, he had been a pretty rough guy. In fact, he spent a lot of time drinking and doing things that probably were not healthy for him and certainly weren't healthy for those around him. And he had been told several times by my grandmother, who was a friend from childhood to him, that if he ever fell off the wagon, that she was going to come find him. She better not hear about him being in one of those places, is the way she talked about it. Well, he told me the story that many decades before that he was in a bar and doing and living it up pretty good, let's put it that way. And all of a sudden the door opens and my grandmother and her husband walk in His name was Creighton. As I mentioned last time, that my grandfather had died, and my grandmother remarried several years later to a deputy sheriff in one of the local counties, and a great guy by the name of Creighton. And they walked in together, but it wasn't Creighton that Tom noticed first. It was my grandmother. She walked all the way across that joint and grabbed him literally by the hair and drug him outside. And she said the whole time, I told you that if I heard about you being in this place, I was going to come get you. Well, Tom said, you know what? That scared me to death, and she hurt me that night, but probably saved my life because she loved me enough to come in even to a place that she would never step in order to help me and to rescue me from the places and direction that I was going. You know, when you think about my grandmother's journey, you think about, as Tom told me that day, that she had had many chances to give up. She had many chances to not care about not only her journey, but anybody's journey around her. But that's not what she did. The more she faced loss, the more she cared about the time and the people around her. And therefore, she wanted to make a difference. In your scripture, Jesus uses the word for mourning that is one of the most intrinsically difficult words in terms of defining what mourning is. And there's several words for mourning in the Greek. But he picks a word that is at the heart of everything. In fact, it is the most difficult type of mourning because it means that you're mourning something that was dear to you that you lost. Not just mourning the passing of a person or a circumstance or a time. You are mourning something that you had invested in. Blessed are those who mourn something that really mattered to them to lose. And the more you love them, the greater the risk of mourning when you lost them. But that's what Jesus is talking about. What Jesus is more afraid of is he's more afraid of us risking not loving in order to save ourselves from the pain because we don't want to have to deal with the mourning and the loss. Therefore, we don't ever invest ourselves into relationships. We don't ever invest ourselves into the places that truly can bring real joy, even if that joy is only for a short time. I think about this as I've had children, and maybe you have children, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. I had no idea that I could love someone as much as I love my children. And it happened from that very first moment. Now, does that mean that it was easy? Does that mean that that I didn't cry with them to get them to go to sleep? Does that mean that I wasn't worried about them and still worried about them? Absolutely not. What it means is that I risk enough to love something that much, knowing that the other side of that in this broken world can be pain and loss and mourning. Jesus, in chapter 11 of the Gospel of John, arrives at the tomb of his friend Lazarus, and he first encounters the disciples who are very much upset and unnerved because people had been upset with him in that particular region. They didn't want to go to be with Lazarus because they were afraid of what would happen to them. And then he encountered Martha, the one who had worked so hard and didn't take time to know what it meant to be close to Jesus. And yet she met him and said, I knew you would come. But then he saw Mary, the one who'd been so faithful to sit at his feet to teach when he was in Bethesda the last time. And he saw the grief in her eyes and all the people around who were just wailing at the loss and at the death of his friend Lazarus. And it says, of course, the shortest verse in the Bible, that Jesus wept. But I don't believe that Jesus wept because of the death of his friend. Jesus knew what was after life. He knew what was going to happen to Lazarus. He knew where Lazarus was at that moment. What he was weeping about was those who had decided that this was all there was, that they had started walking around like they were already dead and living their lives like they were already dead. That's the kind of mourning that's a true loss. That's the kind of mourning where you just don't find comfort, when you are so afraid to invest yourself into the difficult things of life. And friends, Jesus doesn't talk about this as though he doesn't understand it. He understood it with his friend Lazarus. He understood it with so many other miracles, and he understands it with you. Because he understood it as a human being, becoming fully human, he knows the pain and suffering and the loss that oftentimes goes with investing ourselves into the lives and into the journeys of those around us. My wife has done, as a teacher, a lot of staff development. And in North Mississippi many years ago, she was doing staff development at a little town outside of Batesville, Mississippi. And I would drive her up there. We stayed in a motel. This was before we moved to Memphis. And I would drive her to the school. And on the way on this little road from the city where we were staying, you would see that there was this house set about 300 yards off the city, off the road. In this big open field, there was only one tree, and it was about 200 yards from the front porch of that house. Just one single tree, as though an accidental tree just fell down in the middle of that field. And I had gone by there several mornings, and I just wanted to know, why was this tree there? And under this tree, a couple of hundred yards from the porch, was this play set. Now, why wasn't the play set closer to the house, and why was it in the front of the house? I just couldn't figure all this out, and so I did something that most people should probably never do, and I don't know if I've ever done it since. I stopped to knock on the front door and just ask the question. There's got to be a story about this tree and this play set. But I could not have imagined what the story was. You see, this couple, this older woman came to the door, and I told her I was a pastor. Probably she thought I was crazy, but I also kind of went into who I was and what I was doing up in that area. And then I asked her about the tree, and I asked her about the play set. And she had a little smile on her face. And she said, well, that tree was planted in memory of my husband and my son, who died in 1971 on his way to an Ole Miss football game. If you remember, that's when Archie Manning was the quarterback, long before there was a Peyton or an Eli. And she said he was killed on the way to the game. And my husband, who was a farmer who had worked this land his whole life, had been very hard on their son and had really not spent the kind of time as a father should with his son. And then his son was gone. And so someone had given them this tree in memory of their son. And so she said, my husband went and planted it directly out in front of us, so that every day we had to walk out on this front porch. We had to look at that tree, and we had to remember our son. And he said, and he had to remember all the things that he regretted and wished that he could have done differently. About 26 years later, a young man and his wife and their young son shows up at their front door. And it turns out that his son and his fiancée at the time got pregnant. And they had told her family, who lived in Memphis. They were a prominent family. And the family decided, after the death of the other family's son, they decided not to tell that their daughter was pregnant. And so that daughter had that baby and then moved and got married and went to North Carolina. And the family who had lost their son had no idea what was happening until that young man showed up on their doorstep. He had found out about his mother's story, about his biological father, and he wanted to know his biological father's family. And so he came with his young family. And he had a son named Jack. And Jack got to know his great-grandfather. And his great-grandfather, who for over 2 decades had looked out that front door and had seen a tree that was only about mourning and loss, decided to put a play set under it, and he would take Jack by the hand and he would walk him all the way out to that tree, and they would play on that play set. And that place of mourning was transformed into something that was joyful, something other than sorrow. And she said, and her husband had passed away just a few years before I met her. She said, my husband learned what it meant to truly invest himself every day into loving greatly and deeply. Friends, in Romans chapter 8, Paul gets to the end of that passage and he's talking about, are we just lambs that are thrown away? He says, what shall we say about these things? I've used this question a lot at funerals. What shall we say about these things? And I think Jesus would ask you, what shall you say about your life? Have you invested deeply, loving carefully, giving yourself away in spite of the risk so that you could experience the fullness of life? Well, Paul answers his own question. What shall we say about these things in Romans 8? If God is for us, God is with us, who can be against us? I want you to take some time to reflect on this passage. It's a very simple verse, but go through the study guide and ask yourself the question. Are you afraid of the risk of loss, and so you're not loving deeply? What can you do about that?